It's shortly after the end of World War II. A man sits in the witness chair at the Nuremberg Nazi war crimes trial. His crimes are laid out in front of the courtroom. They are terrible crimes. They involve the death of innocents. As the prosecutor lays out his case, the man is called to defend himself. He says, "I was just following orders." This was a common theme among the defendants in the Nuremberg trials. The court had heard it numerous times already. In each case, the defense was discounted. In each case, the defendant was convicted. But the uncomfortable truth is, the defendants in these cases were acting as obedient soldiers under a regime that was intolerant of acts of personal conscience. Many simply subsumed their own identity under crushing tyranny. This does not absolve them of their crimes, but it does give us a window into their minds as they committed atrocity after atrocity. They were raised in a society where they were not given permission to think for themselves. They considered themselves puppets to higher authority. Seeing how the regime punished the innocent, then how would they be treated if they disobeyed orders? All of these factors were known to the court. It did not matter. They were pronounced guilty anyhow. Why? Because obedience does not erase responsibility. This idea was subsequently baked into Article 92 of the Unified Code of Military Justice. The article tells soldiers to obey all legal orders. The implication, of course, is that they are not compelled to follow illegal orders. Yet the excuse still exists. The phrase persists. So why does the concept of "I was just following orders" seem so seductive? It's easy to see why. It relieves one from having to think for oneself. It simplifies complex questions and often chaotic scenarios where there is no time to ponder ethics. It absolves one of responsibility. You can just look to your superior and they will give you an action to take in the heat of the moment. It's also a neat way to absolve one of blame. You didn't give the order. You don't have to take responsibility for it. You can point to another person and say, "It's all their fault." There is a lazy form of internal justification for just following orders. Even if one has the time to think through the consequences of the actions they are called upon to do, the quick and easy instinct is to say to oneself, "Other people have already thought this through. I should just take their word for it." And with that feeling of relief, one simply does as commanded. There is a thread of ethical failure here. Ethics requires that a person think about harm first. Then they have to use their judgment to decide how to respond to that harm. Then they have to decide to act or not to act based on that judgment. You can't shift judgment upward in a hierarchy and still be ethical. You cannot disregard harm that your actions cause and still be ethical. The ethical failure isn't obedience. It's thinking that being obedient absolves one of responsibility. One of the side effects of acting ethically is that there's almost inevitably a cost involved. Failing to follow orders based on one's conscience can come with dire consequences. Punishment is likely to ensue, from being fired from a job or to being arrested and charged as a criminal. It could even imperil your life or the lives of your comrades and loved ones. No one said living ethically was easy. In fact, it's often so difficult to do that some people just avoid it and do hideous things because they were told to do so. So, the defense survived Nuremberg. It survived being placed in the Unified Code of Military Justice. The phrasing might be different. The excuse is more veiled. I don't make policy. I just enforce the law. If I don't do it, someone else will, with the implication that someone else might be worse. These are just variations on a theme. They all boil down to the same thing. I was just following orders. These excuses survive because the alternative, to think through the consequences, to act or not act, and to understand that punishment of one's own self might follow, is too onerous. The quicker, easier path is often followed. I want to bring up a modern organization that is operating right now in the United States. It's Immigration and Customs Enforcement, commonly known as ICE. It's a federal law enforcement organization that has been on the news a lot. This isn't the only organization in the United States with the deep, I was just following orders problem, but it is the most visible, thus my focus on it in this episode. In Minnesota, not long ago, immigration agents detained a father and his young child as they were returning home. The child was just 5 years old. They were taken hundreds of miles away, despite objections from the school officials, and despite the obvious trauma involved. In another case, also reported in the news, a U.S. citizen was detained in his own home, at gunpoint, without a warrant, led outside in the cold in his underwear while agents sorted out the mistake. And there are countless more stories like this. Families separated, children left without parents, homes left without income, not because of violence, not because of imminent danger, but because an order was carried out. No one in these stories needed to be cruel. No one needed to hate anyone. They only needed to follow instructions. That's why this matters. The danger isn't hatred. It's obedience that no longer asks what it's doing to other people. At what point does enforcing policy become personal responsibility for harm? The "I was just following orders" excuse isn't confined to any one ideology. It's not a structural flaw in society. You can find it in all points in history and in all nations on the globe. It's a concept deeply buried into the human condition, which is why it persists to this day. When responsibility is outsourced upwards, ethics disappears downward. Hierarchy should not erase one's own personal conscience, one's own judgment. Uniforms do not erase your obligation to consider harm. Consequences will always follow your actions. Will you be able to live with the consequences if you waive your right to think for yourself? So, what would it take for you to refuse? At what cost would you stop complying? When does following orders stop being acceptable? What consequences would you be willing to accept? These aren't easy questions to answer. If they are, then the scenario you have in mind doesn't have enough possibility of harm in it. Up the stakes. Keep upping them. Ethics is not comfortable, nor is it easy. It does not guarantee safety or protection. It's a process that is designed to reduce harm to others. If ethics only exists when it's convenient, then it isn't ethics at all.